The braziers in the subterranean vaults of the Blackwood hold had not been stoked in over a decade. Isolde knew this because she was the apprentice who had been strictly forbidden from ever bringing hot coals near them. The old midwife's warnings still rang in her ears from the day she arrived at the mountain fortress. The lower vaults lie directly beneath the Alpha's war dais, little one, and the shadows down there catch the crumbs of conversations meant to destroy girls like us. For 2 bitter winters, she had carefully kept her gaze fixed on the floor, deliberately hiding the piercing clarity of her pale, long-blooded eyes whenever the massive iron-reinforced doors at the end of the hall groaned open and Alpha Caelum Thorne filled the frame. Tonight, she stood in the freezing, unlit vaults anyway. She was here because an hour ago, she had heard her own name cast out across the Grand Pack Council like awful to hounds, and the deep baritone that delivered it held no warmth. She was here because the fragile new heartbeat hidden beneath her ribs had begun to pulse frantically the exact moment his booming voice vibrated down through the stone ceiling. She was here because for 6 agonizingly beautiful months, she had loved a man who held her in the secret hours of the night, breathing into her hair that she was the only anchor keeping his wild soul grounded. And tonight, she had to discover if any of those whispered vows had been true, or if she was merely a ghost haunting his grand kingdom. The low flame of the tallow lamp in her hand flickered, threatening to die completely as she melted further into the deep, soot-stained shadows cast by the pillars. Her calloused, bare feet left no trace against the freezing flagstones. Her grandmother had taught her, long before the winter sickness claimed the elder cabins, how to glide through the dark like a deer through brush, setting her heels down first, rolling her weight, holding her breath between paces. "We are small, soft things," she reminded herself as the cruel laughter of Genevieve drifted through the floorboards above, "and this hold is a cavern of teeth." The soot-stained stones of the subterranean vaults were a map of Isolde's daily degradation. While the highborn warriors of the Blackwood hold trained under the open sky and dined in the sunlit upper chambers, her existence was measured by the heavy iron buckets she carried down into the damp dark. Every morning before the first horn blew, her hands were calloused by the rough handles of the water pails, tasked with scrubbing the moisture that wept from the low stone ceiling so it would never rise to rot the floorboards of Alpha Caelum Thorne's war dais above. It was a tedious, invisible chore, meant specifically for an apprentice who possessed no rank, no family name, and no standing within the pack hierarchy. To the council lords, she was merely a pair of hands to keep the foundation from crumbling, a servant expected to move through the shadows without leaving a whisper of her presence behind. This restriction was her boundary line, a physical reminder that she belonged in the subterranean cold, far beneath the notice of the royal wolves who walked in the light. Yet, as she stood perfectly still in the freezing dark, the weight of her low status felt less like a cage and more like a shield. They had spent years teaching her how to be invisible, never realizing that the very silence they forced upon her would become the perfect cover for her defiance. The chill of the stone vaults always brought back the scratchy, tobacco-scented voice of old Martha, the senior hearth-tender who had died during Isolde's second winter in the hold. Martha had been a creature of the corners, her spine permanently bent from 50 years of scrubbing the stains left by alpha tempers, and she had possessed a terrifyingly clear understanding of the predators they served. On Isolde's very first night, as they sat paring withered turnips by the fading embers of the kitchen grate, the old woman had reached out with a hand as rough as tree bark and gripped Isolde's wrist tightly enough to bruise. "Never look a high blood in the eye, little bird," Martha had whispered, her milky, fading eyes wide with a warning that felt older than the fortress itself. To an alpha, an unranked girl isn't a person. She's an itch, or a footstool, or a snack when the hunting is lean. If you catch Caelum Thorne's gaze, you give him a target. They don't see our tears as pain, child. They see them as blood in the water, and once a wolf smells blood, his instinct is to tear until there is nothing left to weep. The warning had settled deep into Isolde's bones, a cold truth that she had carried through every dark hallway and quiet corridor. In the grand hierarchy of the Blackwood hold, the ruling class did not look down to see what they were crushing beneath their heavy, leather-bound boots. They simply stepped, leaving the small and the nameless to sweep up the pieces of their own shattered lives in the dark. For 2 long, silent years, survival had been a matter of exquisite choreography. Isolde had mastered the art of becoming part of the stonework, a shadow that moved with the sole purpose of remaining unremarked. Every afternoon when the heavy boots of the elite pack guards signaled Alpha Caelum Thorne's approach, her routine was absolute. She would press her shoulders tight against the cold corridor walls, tuck her chin into the frayed collar of her servant's tunic, and drop her gaze to the floor. Her most dangerous liability was not her low status, but the rare, long-blooded heritage written clearly across her features, most notably her eyes, which carried a piercing, silver-gray clarity that belonged to an ancient lineage the current pack lords had spent generations trying to dilute. To look up, to let the light catch that striking gaze, was to invite curiosity, and curiosity from an alpha was a death sentence for a nameless apprentice. And so, she had learned to read the world through the shapes of leather boots and the heavy drag of iron scabbards across the flagstones. She knew the precise cadence of Caelum's stride, the way the air grew heavy and pressurized with his dominant aura long before he actually rounded the corner. She would hold her breath, forcing her heart into a slow, dull rhythm, pretending to be nothing more than an inanimate fixture of his grand estate. She had trained her body to yield, to shrink, and to flatten itself against the margins of his world, believing that if she made herself small enough, the teeth of the ruling class would never find a reason to sink into her flesh. Tonight, every carefully rehearsed movement of her submissive choreography was shattered. The silent, rhythmic bowing of her head and the deliberate shielding of her silver-gray eyes were discarded like old rags on the cellar floor. A strange, cold fire had taken root in the center of her chest, burning away the ingrained instinct to shrink back into the shadows when the distant echo of heavy leather boots began to reverberate down the corridor. For 2 years, those approaching footsteps had been a cue to disappear, to flatten her shoulders against the stone and pretend to be an inanimate object. But tonight, as the air grew heavy with the suffocating, familiar pressure of Alpha Caelum Thorne's dominant aura, Isolde did not press herself into the margins of the hallway. Instead, she stood her ground, her spine straightening with a sudden, rigid dignity that she had spent her entire life hiding from the wolves who ruled the hold. The absolute submission that had kept her safe for so many winters cracked wide open, replaced by a reckless, unyielding resolve. She allowed her chin to rise, her gaze lifting from the safe familiarity of the flagstones to stare directly at the massive, iron-reinforced doors at the end of the forbidden vault. The transition was sharp and absolute, an invisible declaration of war against her own fear. The nameless, unranked apprentice who had trained her body to yield had vanished in a single heartbeat, leaving behind a woman who refused to let the darkness swallow her whole any longer. She was breaking every rule she had spent years memorizing because her name had been dragged through the mud just an hour before. It had not been whispered in a quiet corner or muttered by a jealous fellow servant. It had been hurled like offal across the Alpha's private chamber, sounding loud and distorted through the heavy oak doors. The voice that had spoken it belonged to the very man she had trusted, but it held none of the secret warmth she had foolishly come to rely on. Instead, Alpha Caelum Thorne's tone had been sharp, laced with a cruel, performative arrogance meant to satisfy the high-born wolves gathered at his side. He had spoken of her not as a person, but as a minor, inconsequential detail in his grand political designs, a low-born healer's apprentice who was useful precisely because she didn't have the status to make demands. Hearing her identity reduced to a cheap punchline in the seat of power had sliced through her remaining defenses more cleanly than any blade. It was a betrayal that tasted like ash, stripping away the illusion of safety she had built around his private promises. The harsh reality of his public mockery had driven her from her safe sanctuary, compelling her to march straight toward the source of her executioner's laughter because she could no longer live in the quiet space between his lies. The violation of his betrayal cut deeper than a simple wounding of her pride. It rippled inward, striking the fragile secret she carried beneath her ribs. As Alpha Caelum Thorne's booming voice vibrated through the heavy timbers of the floorboards once more, a distinct, restless flutter bloomed in the pit of her stomach. The unborn child, a tiny spark of high-blooded wolf lineage still hidden from the world, stirred an immediate, frantic response to its father's thunderous tone. It was a sharp, internal physical reaction that escalated the stakes from personal heartbreak to a desperate battle for survival. The movement was a quiet warning, a phantom hand knocking against her womb, reminding her that she was no longer protecting just her own small life in the margins of the Blackwood hold. The heir to his throne, carrying the same ancient bloodline that Caelum was currently dismissing as inconsequential in front of the pack, could already feel the heavy, oppressive weight of its father's dominant aura. That single, frantic flutter solidified the terrifying reality of what was truly at risk. If she stayed, if she allowed herself to be crushed by his cruel political games, this innocent life would be born into a world of teeth and calculation, or worse, sacrificed entirely to appease the high-born ambitions of noble women like Genevieve. The child's sudden, protective stirring became the ultimate catalyst, turning her fear into concrete resolve. She pressed a trembling, calloused hand against her stomach, soothing the internal panic as she realized her flight was no longer a choice of dignity, but a mandatory rescue mission into the dark. The sting of his current cruelty was made unbearable by the ghosts of the last 6 months, a half-year woven entirely from threadbare illusions and stolen midnight warmth. Before he had dragged her name before his council, like a trophy of his indifference, Alpha Caelum Thorne had been a completely different creature in the quiet, silvered sanctuary of the northern woods. In those secret hours, far from the critical eyes of the pack lords and the suffocating ambition of high-born noblewomen like Genevieve, his dominant aura had softened into something resembling a sanctuary. He had held Isolde against his chest beneath the shelter of the ancient pines, his massive, scarred hands surprisingly gentle as they tangled in her hair. He had breathed into her neck, whispering sweet, unyielding promises that she was the only anchor keeping his wild soul grounded, swearing by the moon that his heart belonged exclusively to a nameless healer's apprentice who mended his wounds without asking for a throne. Those private vows had been her shelter, a quiet magic she had treasured above all else, believing that the fierce, protective wolf who wept in her arms during the dead of winter was the true man, and the cold ruler on the dais was merely a mask. But as the echoes of his callous laughter filtered down through the floorboards, the agonizing contrast shattered the last of her naivety. The sweet promises were not an anchor. They were a snare, a collection of beautiful lies meant to keep a low-born girl compliant and quiet while he built his kingdom on her silence. The realization that she had given her heart to a phantom left a hollow, freezing ache in her chest, converting the memory of his touch from a warm embrace into a brand of utter betrayal. The crushing ambiguity of his words left her suspended in a private purgatory, driven forward by a desperate, agonizing need for absolute truth. She could endure the cold winters of the mountain hold, she could survive the grueling labor of her low status, and she could even bear the weight of a hidden pregnancy in a world that offered no protection to the unranked. What she could not survive, what would permanently hollow out the very core of her being, was the lingering, parasitic doubt of whether those 6 months of tenderness had been nothing more than a calculated performance. She needed to know if the man who had held her by the frozen stream, the wolf who had pressed his forehead against hers and sworn his soul to her keeping, had ever truly existed, or if he was merely a cruel mirage conjured by her own desperate loneliness. If his love had been real, then this public betrayal was a tragic, incomprehensible riddle she might one day find the strength to solve. But if it had all been a game, if he had looked into her rare, silver-gray eyes and seen only a disposable convenience to pass the long winter nights, then the foundation of her entire reality would collapse into ash. To carry his child in silence meant she had to know exactly what kind of blood ran through its veins, the blood of a man who had loved its mother with a fierce, secret devotion, or the blood of a monster who considered their shared existence a cheap joke to amuse high-born noblewomen like Genevieve. This was the ultimate question that propelled her bare feet across the freezing flagstones, a relentless, burning obsession that conquered her fear and demanded an answer from the very lips that had promised her eternity. The freezing reality of the present rushed back over her, a sudden, sharp shock of physical sensation that dragged her out of her spinning thoughts. The smooth flagstones of the lower vaults were no longer just a metaphor for her low status. They were blocks of black ice beneath her calloused, bare feet, sending a bitter ache straight up through her ankles. In her trembling fingers, the low flame of the tallow lamp guttered and hissed, its dying warmth casting frantic, dancing shadows against the soot-stained pillars. The air smelled of damp earth, old stone, and the distant, stifling scent of roasting meat and heavy ale filtering down from the grand hall above. She stood at the precipice of her discovery, completely exposed if the light should fail her. Taking a slow, deep breath, Isolde forced her mind to steady itself, calling upon the quiet, defensive wisdom that had kept her lineage alive for generations. Her grandmother had taught her long before the winter sickness took her how to navigate a forest of predators, lessons passed down not with weapons, but with the quiet physics of survival. "Set your heels down first, little bird," the old woman's voice whispered in her memory, "then roll your weight onto the ball of the foot. Hold your breath between steps. Let the world think the wind is moving the grass, not a person." Embracing the ancestral technique, Isolde became a phantom. She stepped deliberately from the heel, her movements perfectly synchronized with the heavy, rhythmic thrumming of the celebratory drums above. Her breath was a slow, controlled stream held tightly between each stride, preventing even the softest sigh from betraying her position. She did not look at her feet. She looked ahead, her rare, silver-gray eyes wide in the gloom as she mapped the contours of the columns. The ancient skill was an invisible armor, transforming her from a terrified servant into a deliberate hunter of her own truth, gliding through the freezing dark with a grace that the heavy-footed alphas above could never hope to mimic. The absolute silence of her footsteps was her only inheritance, a fragile barrier between her existence and the crushing weight of the pack's hierarchy. Standing frozen in the dark, listening to the muffled vibrations of alpha pride and noble ambition directly above her head, Isolde came to a sudden, crystalline understanding of her place in this grand design. She was a small, soft creature built of quiet breath and hidden heartbeats, an unranked apprentice navigating a subterranean labyrinth beneath a fortress of apex predators. For generations, the world had been ruled by those with massive frames, sharp teeth, and voices that could break a person's spirit before they ever bared their fangs. The wolves of the Blackwood Hold believed that power was measured solely by the volume of a man's roar and the trail of blood left behind his boots. They did not understand that the deer still ran in the forests long after the wolves grew old and died, surviving not because they could fight the teeth, but because they knew exactly how to move through the briars without leaving a single tuft of fur behind. Her smallness was not a curse. It was a deliberate, patient design. It was the ancestral wisdom that allowed her to carry a royal heir right beneath their noses while they laughed at her simplicity. Let them keep their iron thrones, their loud declarations, and their public cruelties. In a world completely full of predators, it was the quietest things, the things that moved with empty hands and held their breath between steps, that ultimately survived to see the spring, keeping their dignity intact while the great and the terrible tore themselves to pieces in the light.